Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Welcome if it's your first time at ICCP since Ramadan. Ramadan Mubarak. I hope everybody's having a healthy, happy, and joyous Ramadan and they're able to get in the worship that they intended for this month. We begin in the name of Allah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah wa kafa wa salatu wa salam ala habib al-Mustafa wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. اللهم لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت الحكيم العليم. We begin with the statement of the angels to Allah that there's no knowledge except for that which He has bestowed. Surely He is the possessor of all knowledge and of all wisdom. And so we ask Allah al-manshur alayna rahmatak that He will allow His wisdom to descend upon us. Wanshur alayna rahmatak, and all of His mercy will flow between us and among us. Ya Dhal Jalali wal Ikram, O possessor of all majesty and all dignity and honor. Um, it's a blessed gathering and it's a very blessed time to meet after the time of the Asr in the afternoon and in the basically the last hour before the time of Maghrib. This is a time which the Prophet ﷺ said, the thalathun la turaddu da'watuhum. There are three categories of people, their dua is not rejected. And that is as-sa'im hina yaftur, the one who's fasting at the end, making a call to Allah before breaking their fast. It's one of the things we go to iftaris and parties and gatherings and we get distracted in greeting each other and we lose sight of actually such a valuable moment. You don't need to say something really long, you can say something very simple. But there's a moment of joy that happens at the time of breaking the fast. There's a sense of accomplishment. There's the immediate gratification of breaking the fast, but there's something deeper. There's a sense that you fulfilled an obligation to Allah, and you were like within a force field, as the Prophet ﷺ said, "As-sawmu junnah." Fasting is a shield. So it's like you're under Allah's protection, and the only thing that's alike to it is when you complete the Hajj and you're at the very end of the Hajj and you feel like you're ending, so you should be sad. It's like Tawaf al Wada, when you do that final Tawaf, it's kind of bittersweet. But when you finish the Hajj, it's not bittersweet at all, it's just sweet because you feel like I did it. There are a lot of high fives involved, right? And everyone's hugging each other because there's a sense of like, I fulfilled my intention. So I hope we have that. That's the backdrop. That's very positive energy is what I'm trying to say. Because I think a lot of times we get so bogged down in the month of Ramadan, like, oh, I thought I was gonna have more time. Like, no, you work 50 hours. Like you have school, you have exams. It's If you're looking for quantity, you're always going to set yourself up for disappointment because you're never going to read as much of the Quran or attend as many classes or come to the masjid as many days as you intended, right? So if you like, well, my intention was this and I'm doing less than my intention, then you're setting up yourself for failure, right? If the goal is quality and connection, then that's something that you can aspire to and you won't feel that sense of defeat, which I think is a very negative energy and it prevents people from really ascending in the month of Ramadan. And in that vein of thinking, this book of Imam Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, it's not really the translation. The author, the translator, he calls it Path to Sufism, but it's not really about Sufism at all. It's really about the personal journey of Imam Abu Hamid al-Ghazali. And this class is not about Tasawwuf either. It's not about Sufism, but of course it's connected to that. It's Al-Munqidh min al-Dalala, deliverance from error. And this is an introduction into the life and the ideas of Imam al-Ghazali. It's impossible that in 4 sessions we're going to cover all of his thought, but we're going to convey his most important ideas. And if you'd like to study Imam al-Ghazali in depth, um, then there are lots of opportunities to do so. I expect that Dr. Tariq al-Gawhari will be joining us in the very end of the session. He's a wonderful resource. He's a much greater expert in Imam al-Ghazali than I am. And Chavez is here too, so we can pick his brain because he's read probably more Ghazali books than I have. Um, but we want to take a holistic view, right? We're not just talking about Ghazali, we're taking his ideas and we're trying to fit it within the bigger spectrum of ideas. And why are we choosing this? It's because Imam al-Ghazali is probably the single most influential Islamic thinker in history. Sounds like a big statement. I'm not saying it lightly because there have been other great scholars. In my opinion, there have been greater scholars than him, right? He's not the biggest scholar that has ever walked the face of the earth. That's not him. But he is the greatest thinker. Why? Because he refuted all of the challenges to Islam during his age, and as a result, he was named Hujjatul Islam, the proof of Islam. And Imam al Ghazali is the key figure for a person who has a crisis of faith, someone who has doubts or is questioning, or even if you want greater certainty. He poses in the beginning of the book the question that he's always been a person who isn't just a follower. He's not a sheep, which is how we would translate it today. He always thinks independently and arrives at his own decisions, and he always challenges ideas, and he doesn't just follow tradition blindly. And then he mentions the hadith connected to that, which we'll get to. Last year, we talked about a couple of his statements. One of them that we mentioned is that knowledge without action is a burden, and action without knowledge is misguidance. Right? And this is one of the key statements he says in Ya Ayyuhal Walad, and he has similar ideas here. He's also said that to get what you love, you must first be patient with that which you hate. So, in order to receive that which you love, you have to be patient with what you hate. And this is a very different way of approaching spirituality. We've talked about this in the Wednesday session. We have this spirituality program here throughout the year in which we talk about the hikam, the aphorisms of Ibn Ata'illah, about how you can't chase a sense of spiritual ecstasy, a sense of spiritual connection itself. Because then what happens is your emotional state becomes the goal, right? And that becomes your aspiration, is to achieve a certain state. Rather, genuine spirituality is to witness reality, right? And the greatest reality, of course, being the knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So if your goal is spirituality rather than Allah, then your spirituality will fall short. And this is a very, very important concept in Islamic spirituality, and this is where we diverge from other faith traditions and other ways. So that's why when people talk about Islamic mysticism, has anyone heard this term? Islamic mysticism is an oxymoron, okay? But this is just my viewpoint. I also don't like the word saint because we have no concept of sainthood in Islam. I don't use that word, right? If we want to translate wali, we just use the word wali. We don't use the word saint, right? But the idea of mysticism within Islam makes no sense because the whole summation of spirituality and especially tasawwuf, what is the number one goal of tasawwuf? I'll ask all of you. Or tazkiyah, or purifying your heart. It is to do what? What are we trying to do? Draw closer to Allah. This is Islam. That's the right, this is all of Islam. But what is spirituality in Islam? The Hadith Jibril gives us the clue, but what are we trying to accomplish? What will make you spiritual? Again, this is the way, right? This is the way to achieve it. I think I didn't explain it right. You're all giving the answers of how we do it. But I'm asking, what's the goal? What are we trying to achieve? Ma'rifah. The goal of all, and this is agreed upon by all Muslims, but we just haven't organized our thoughts, right? All of you know that too. That the goal is to know Allah. The goal is gnosis. So Islamic spirituality is about knowing Allah. And when you use the word mysticism, what is that? It should be Islamic demysticism, right? Because knowing Allah is about demystifying. So for Muslims approach spirituality from the vantage point that Allah is knowable. And Allah created us in order to know Him. This is the first premise, which is that the human being and the human intellect and the human heart can know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Otherwise, what's the point? If Allah created us and we can never know Him, then there's nothing to do. Then you're trying. So that's why we don't say that we're trying to know the unknowable. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala cannot be completely captured. لا تدركه الأبصار وهو يدرك الأبصار. Right? So no eyes can capture Him, but He captures everything, meaning His knowledge covers everything. وَسِعَ كُرْسِيُّهُ السَّمَاوَاتُ وَالْأَرْضِ. His kursi, His throne, it extends to the heavens of the earth, and His knowledge covers everything. But we can know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala because He has made Himself knowable. And He created us in order that He would be known. And so the act of even creating us is an expression of love from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we never wonder, does Allah love us? He even loves the creation that is disobedient to Him. What about the one who is obedient and is fasting? That's something totally different. So the entire life of Imam al-Ghazali is a quest for truth and for reality. I'll begin with a story. I'm sure many of you know it, but inshallah it's beneficial. It's a story, which I'll say in a moment, in which bandits caused him to acquire great knowledge. So you would think that like being robbed at a young age would be such a traumatic incident that it would totally turn you off and say, well, what does any of this mean anyway? Right? It looks like, or many of us would take it the negative way. We're like, it's a sign, right? So like bad things happen, we have challenges or obstacles, and we're like, it's a sign from Allah that I'm not supposed to do this. No, when in many cases it's a sign that like you're going to have some challenges and obstacles along the way. Not everything is going to be smooth. So the existence of challenges is one tangential point, which is the existence of obstacles doesn't mean that you're not meant to do something, right? Many of us are, we that's where our mind tends to go. And he is universally considered the great mujaddid of the 11th century. The Prophet ﷺ said that inna Allah yab'athu ala ra'si kulli mi'ati sana man yujaddidu dina, that Allah sends someone every 100 years, an individual who revives the religion. So the idea is that the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam is khatamun nabiyyin. He is the seal of all prophets. However, Allah continues to send people, and He continues to have His awliya, those who are close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and those are the ones who revive it. And in many cases, yujaddid, tajdeed doesn't mean reform. Tajdeed means, and in many cases, the way it's implemented is going to change in different societies, in different scenarios. But what you're doing is you're taking that original ethos, those set of first principles, and now you're bringing it to life in a way that touches the heart and affects people. The greatest contribution of Imam al Ghazali, in my opinion, is the Ihya. I know that in academic circles, they won't agree with that statement. And there are others who are interested in theology. They also won't agree with that statement. But the Ihya, others have spoken about philosophy and others have written about theology. He's not the only one. We have greater theologians than Imam al Ghazali, but he is the only one that has effectively and completely demonstrated that at the essence, at the core of every single belief of a Muslim and every single practice that we implement as a Muslim, there is a deep spiritual purpose. There is a refinement of the soul and of the heart, and that it should be transformative. So when he talks about facing the Qibla in Salah, he talks about how you have to face your heart. When there's an intention, it's not just something that you say with the tongue, but it's something that you feel. When you go in Hajj, when you wrap yourself in shroud, it means that you're taking off your connection to the dunya. When you put on the shroud, it's reminding you of your afterlife, and it's reminding you of death. When you rotate in the tawaf, right, it is showing that you should put Allah at the focus of your attention, right? So then he goes through step by step each and every act of worship and connects it to a spiritual purpose. And this is very important because at the time, you had groups of people who were just talking about philosophical theology, right? And then there were others who were talking about blind taqleed, imitation. And we'll talk about taqleed in what? Right? Because there's taqleed in fiqh, that's something different. And then there was a third set of people. Sufis, as you know, were a major group at that time, right? In the time of Al Ghazali, and his approach to tasawwuf is completely different. It's more, in my view, it's more grounded in Sharia. It's more connected to the Quran and the Sunnah than the Sufis of his time. In the Sufis of his time, they were mostly paying attention to themes of mushahada, trying to witness the divine. Now, of course, there are some people who have written and discussed about this, like Sheikh Abdul Qadir al-Jilani and many others. I'm not going to cast aspersions against anyone, but for a regular Muslim like me, it's inaccessible for me to talk about mushahada, because the idea of knowing Allah and truly witnessing the divine is something that I don't expect that I will experience in my lifetime. And I don't know how studying it and learning about it, other than trying to put myself in a trance like state, is going to create a genuine connection with Allah. And in addition to mushahada and mukashafa, the idea that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will unveil realities, which as Muslims we do believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as Allah says in Surah Al-Kahf, وَآتَيْنَاهُ مِن لَدُنَّا عِلْمًا. So Allah gave Khidr alayhi salam, for example. I say alayhi salam because I consider Khidr as a prophet. I know that's a minority view, but I consider lots. I consider Maryam also as a prophet, right? That that he was given knowledge about the true realities of things and about future events that others were unaware of. Even Musa alayhi salam, it doesn't mean that Khidr is better than Musa. In my, according to the sound opinion, Musa alayhi salam was the most knowledgeable, but only of the knowledge of the Torah and the book. And Khidr was given a knowledge that Musa had no access to. This is al-ilm al-ladunni, right? This is the knowledge which is more esoteric that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives some of his servants, and he can give that to his servants even after the prophethood, right? But the problem with what the message at the time of Al-Ghazali that some of the Sufis were promoting of Al-Mukashafa and Al-Mushahada, to him did not address the crisis of faith that he was facing and that others in his age were facing. And namely, there were two main crises. The first one was the crisis of skepticism and cynicism. And this is directly in response to the inadequacy of traditional knowledge. And I'm saying this critically because people like myself, Dr. Tariq, we are the products of traditional modes of asanid, right? We learn from one teacher who learns from another teacher who learns from another teacher, right? The traditional knowledge is about studying a text with a teacher and mastering it and then graduating and going to the next test, going to the next phase. And in many cases, in academic circles, they speak very critically of this system because what it does, it engenders great loyalty to prior ways of thinking, right? And it's a very slow moving vehicle. If you want to have a reformation or a progressive movement, then this type of traditional knowledge is not conducive to that. And in that time, there was a great threat, which was the movement of the Batiniya. The Batiniya threat, this is that's what Imam al-Ghazali talks about. But let me give you a little bit of a historic context. The Batiniya at that time were actually Ismailis. I shouldn't say Ismailis because you're going to think it's the Ismailis today. So I don't want to confuse anyone. But at that time, that was one of the Ismaili branches, right? And it had a lot of followers, and they were also active in a military conflict against the Seljuk Empire, right? And that, well, the Abbasid Empire first. The Seljuk came later. And so Imam al-Ghazali faces a crisis of skepticism, of cynicism. He's examining the path of Kalam. And he studies under Imam al-Juwayni, who arguably is the greatest scholar of that time. Right? And Imam al-Ghazali after him is, I think, definitely the greatest scholar of his time. Right? And so he studies the path of Kalam, right, of theology, which is designed to refute falasifa, right? The Greek oriented philosophy. And he also examines the path of the Sufis. And for academics, if you study Imam al Ghazali in an academic setting, in a university setting, you are only going to hear about this first crisis because that is the crisis that they're interested in. They're like, oh, him and Ibn Rushd, they're duking it out, right? So he writes the book, Tahafatul Falasifa, the incoherence of the philosophers, talking about how they think they're so logical, but they're not really because everything is just axioms and they make assumptions and they talk about certainty, but it's like it's a house of cards built on nothing. I'm grossly oversimplifying, right? The argument is like a huge book, right? And then Ibn Rushd, he writes another one. So it seems a little petty, but it's kind of humorous. Then he writes like Tahafut al-Tahafut, about the incoherence of the incoherence. And actually this you know, this conflict between Ibn Rushd and him is actually very helpful to Imam al Ghazali, because Imam al Ghazali actually wins. It looks like he's winning. Again, it's Ibn Rushd and Greek philosophy, because the refutation from Ibn Rushd does not address any of the criticisms that Imam al Ghazali talks about. We'll talk briefly about this conflict. Our main interest is in the second crisis. The second crisis is more important for our purpose. This is the crisis of the ruh. This is the crisis of the spirit and of motivation. And so, after his life journey, when he gets older in age, he authors this beautiful, beautiful book that I believe every Muslim, when I mentioned I was doing this book with Dr. Tariq, he told me he reads this book. You want to know how many times you've read this book? He told me he reads it every year. I was like, I've only read it twice. And I'm teaching the book. So, Dr. Tariq, if you want to have any questions about the book, just skip me and go to Dr. Tariq, because apparently he reads the book every year. Um, and so we should at least, the point of the story is read it at least once, right? He wrote this beautiful book. It's an autobiography of his life talking about these two crises. Now, this crisis is caused by his appointment as the head of An-Nizamiya. This is the university in Baghdad that was the most prestigious academic position in the Muslim world. You might ask, how come I've never heard of An-Nizamiya? The reason you never heard about it is what happened later on in Baghdad in human history. Why did everything get wrecked? The Mongols invaded and everything got destroyed. So when you talk about centers of learning, everything shifted west, right? So you have Qayrawan in Tunis, you have Al Qarawin, you have in Fez, and you have Al Azhar University in Egypt, of course. Why is it that if you look in Maryland, Imam Chad is there, Sheikh Walid is Azhari. I also studied there. Dr. Tariq is Al Azhar. Almost every Imam in Maryland is Azhari, is from Al Azhar, and that is a great result of the Mongol invasion, right? So originally, Baghdad was the center of learning, right, at that time, but everything shifted west, and that's why the Ottomans also shifted to the west. Now, after he's appointed, he has this crisis, and he disappears like completely. Like there's no mention of him for like almost 10 years. Actually, not almost, over 10 years. Now, the amazing thing is that when he emerges, he has a pile of books that he's written, and it's his most productive period, and that is when his greatest books were written. And this is the period when he wrote the Ihya, which is a masterpiece. And arguably, I mean, I'm not in this field, but people who edit these books know that there are multiple versions of the Ihya Ulumuddin, and they're all arguably authentic. What happened was, as he was working on the book, he kept updating it and changing it, as they didn't have Microsoft Word, so you couldn't track your changes. So, they kept updated in different manuscripts. And what he wrote in this book is that the Islamic spiritual tradition had become completely neglected, and that the spiritual sciences that were taught by the early generations of Muslims had been forgotten. And this is interesting. This put Imam al Ghazali straight in the mainstream, right? And if anyone is interested, Sheikh Hamza Yusuf has translated a book by Sidi Ahmed Zarruq called Qawa'id al-Tasawwuf, which are about I don't know what they called it in English, but it means like the parameters of Tasawwuf, of Sufism. And this is very important, because what happens is, and I hope I don't offend anyone or upset anyone here, but when you go into excess into Sharia, and then you will lose the spirituality of the religion, which is an inherent part of the religion. You have to remove spirituality. It's naturally part of it. Tasawwuf is part of Islam. It's not a separate sect. But then on the other side, over time, what happened was that uh, Tasawwuf had become very formulaic. It had been very oriented, very hierarchical, very structured, based on the tariqah system. And even the translator, when he talks about the tariqah, uses a capital W, the way, various ways. And so, according to Imam al Ghazali, and I concur with that, but I don't think this is the only opinion, this is one opinion, which is that actually what ends up happening when you blindly follow your Sufi sheikh and your tariqah without paying attention to the early generations of Muslims, you will actually lose some of the spirituality of the Salaf. However, I'm not saying there's no benefit. There's a lot of benefit for a lot of people to have a spiritual practice of joining a tariqah and having a sheikh and being a murid of someone who is going to guide you on that spiritual path. So I don't want to erase that benefit. I think there is a benefit, but the negative side that Imam al Ghazali witnessed in his time was that it became about the membership, it became about the name, it wasn't about the actual spirituality in worship. And in one way, that one litmus test that you can use to realize this is when people in spiritual circles emphasize their dhikr more than the salah, right? And there are various ways in which that happens. People are like, oh, we're in the middle of a milad, but the time of Maghrib has passed. So you're doing this because you want to honor the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ and honor him, but you're neglecting his sunnah, which is agreed upon by all four madhahib, of praying the Maghrib Salah as quickly as possible. In some cases, it's not possible. You're at work, something prevents you, but everybody's gathered and they're like, oh, we have to complete the milad, this random formula that we think is so important, and we're going to delay Salat al Maghrib. I warned you in the beginning, I'm going to offend some people, but I hope you'll stay with me, right? Because we want to have a balanced way of thinking, right? So, and that's what happens, which is that when you follow certain formulas, sometimes you will lose sense of priorities. You will lose what's important and what's not important. And in the view of Imam al-Ghazali, the Sufis of his time, they had lost. They had the right goal. They were looking for ma'rifah, gnosis, a connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So in the end, he comes to the conclusion that yes, they out of all of the groups, they are the closest, right? And they are the ones that have their priorities right. But they had lost sense of that. And so then he authors the Ihya Ulumuddin. Um, and let's talk about the story of his life, a little bit about his biography. He's born in Attus. Attus is in Khurasan, which probably nobody knows where Khurasan is. That's in northern Iraq towards the side of Afghanistan. So a lot of people don't know. I meet people who are Afghan sometimes and say, "Oh, that's the land of Khurasan, and that's where Imam Abu Hanifa is from." And they're like, "What? Imam Hanifa is from Afghanistan? Everybody says he's from Persia." But the borders that we're following today are very different from the historical borders. So part of Afghanistan today is part of Persia. It was a much bigger. When people say Persia, they're talking about something different. So he's in Attus. His father died of poverty and left him and his brother Ahmad in the care of a Sufi leader. And then he went to Gorgan, which is another city in the same province in Iran, for education. And what people describe is that he's very bookish. He's a really nerdy, very precocious kid, especially compared to his brother Ahmad. His brother Ahmad really connects and goes down the Sufi path. But Imam al Ghazali is very attentive to studying and writing and researching, and he is famous for his notes, you know. And I really relate to this because I'm one of those people that, my handwriting looks like chicken scratches. When I was in law school, I still have all my books and they're just covered, all the margins. And when I was studying Sharia, I wrote all the margins. And now I look back at my notes and they're so dumb. But that's where I was at the time, right? So I'm like defining like basic words, you know. And that's a good sign if you look back at your notes and you're like, what was I thinking? So that means you're in a positive trajectory. Alhamdulillah. And so Imam al Ghazali was similar. He had years and years of notes. He had collected over 5 years of notes and books. And he was worried when he saw the bandits that they're going to take away everything that I have. That is his life's most treasured possession, are his notes, his knowledge. And the bandits, they take all of his stuff, and then he tells them, he says, there's so much knowledge contained within these books, in these notebooks, at least, and there's no benefit for you. What are you going to do with them? And please give them back to me. And the leader of these bandits, unknowingly, right? This is really the turning point in the life of Imam al Ghazali. He says, you claim to know, but in reality, you lack any knowledge. Because when I take knowledge from you, you're left without any knowledge. And instead of learning by heart, you've left all of your knowledge on the pages of your notes, right? And this is why they say, in Arabic they have a saying that al-ilmu fil ra's wa laysa fil kurras, that knowledge is in the mind, it's not in the notebook. And so Imam al-Ghazali, he reflects on this and he thinks not about the bandit, but about the one that puts those words on his tongues. And he interprets that Allah sent that thief. I mean, look at the perspective. Imagine going through life. When good things happen, you think that, oh, Allah is sending this to me. When something bad happens, that Allah wanted me to heed this warning. So he views it as a warning from Allah. That's how he interprets it. And within 3 years, he memorizes all of his notes, and he's not dependent on textbooks anymore. Then he travels to Nisapur, and he studies under the great, we call him Imam al-Haramain, right? Imam al-Juwayni, he's the greatest scholar, and at the time he's very notable because he is a scholar of ilm al-kalam. And he said that Imam al-Ghazali, so as we mentioned, the knowledge of kalam is about using philosophy to refute Greek theological philosophy, and to um, basically prove the authenticity of orthodoxy of Islam. So this is the knowledge of kalam, and he said that Imam al-Ghazali is a deep ocean of knowledge. And then Imam al-Ghazali, he authors a book called Al-Malhul. This is a book of fiqh, of jurisprudence. And his teacher, he says, when he read this book, he said that Muhammad, is Muhammad al-Ghazali, he said that you buried me alive. Couldn't you at least have waited for me to die first before you published this book? Right? Because it's embarrassing for a teacher when, I mean, he's joking, obviously, right? That his student has exceeded him in knowledge and in wisdom. And when it comes to kalam, Imam al-Ghazali, he said that I did not write anything about theology until I had memorized 12,000 pages of the leading theologians. So now Nizam al-Mulk, he's the ruler, he notices this, and he has this idea that he's going to use Sunni Islam and Imam al-Ghazali to disprove the Batiniya movement. Why? Because they had already been defeating them militarily, because all the Turkish tribes, they had converted to Islam. So now Central Asia, beyond the borders of Iran, Persia, they have all become Muslim. So now militarily they're defeating the Batiniya. But now there's something deeper. It's like beating ISIS, right? But even after you beat ISIS, you have to defeat the ideology. You have to brand them as Khawarij, right? So they lose legitimacy. And so Hassani Sabah, who's the leader of the Batiniya, he has turned everything into a bloodbath, right? And they have an assassination plot in which all the high-ranking leaders, they assassinate them individually. He declares himself as ma'asum, that he is sinless, that he's infallible. Right, guys, if you ever want to start a cult, this is how you do it. Right, you write a book. Just say that you're ma'asum, you're infallible, you're the long lost imam, and people, for some reason, people just love and just follow them. So he has all these followers, even though now it seems bizarre. Like, would somebody really follow that? So Nizam al-Mulki invites Imam al-Ghazali to Baghdad, which is, basically the most populated city in the world, which all these universities are centers of learning. And he's teaching over 300 students. He learned Greek while he was there, because when he was in Nishapur with Imam al-Haramain, he didn't study that. He does research in philosophy. And what does he notice? He realizes that there are imperfections in the philosophy of Aristotle, Socrates, and Plato. And he said that it's dangerous because it creates doubts in our faith. So what he does is he writes a book. Look how smart he is. He writes a book called Maqasid al-Falasifa, the aims of philosophy. Establishes himself, he associates himself with philosophy. He's like, okay, I know what you guys are thinking, right? Before he starts debating them. And in his book, this book, he says, Al-Munqidh, he says that from youth to over the age of 50, I never shied away from diving deep into the vast oceans. I wanted to free myself from taqleed. So the concept here that he introduces us is taqleed. In the matters of fiqh, where to put the hands in the prayer, how many takbirat, on the day of Eid, whether to raise the hand in Salatul Janaza. These are matters of taqleed, of imitation. Now, why is it that taqleed is something praiseworthy in matters of fiqh? The reason is we're not mujtahideen. Myself, if I study for the next 20, 30, 40, if I study for the rest of my life, I don't anticipate I'm ever going to be a mujtahid and reach that level of knowledge. I'm always going to be following somebody else. That is taqleed. I'm not synthesizing new rulings myself. Why is it praiseworthy in the domain of fiqh? Because we don't have that level of knowledge, but it's very blameworthy when it comes to eat. When it comes to aqidah and belief, this is very important. A lot of people believe something because someone else has said that. Allah talks about that in the Quran. أَوَلَوْ كَانَ آبَاؤُهُمْ لَا يَعْقِلُونَ شَيْئًا وَلَا يَهْتَدُونَ in Surah Luqman. What if their forefathers were idiots? لَا يَعْقِلُونَ شَيْئًا. What if they didn't understand anything? وَلَا يَهْتَدُونَ. Then they're going to be completely misguided. So you shouldn't believe something blindly. In Islam, we don't believe in blind faith. We don't believe in following tradition and inheriting from the elders. So what he sets off to do is to create foundations of certainty. And he says that the human condition is ignorance of the unseen worlds of Allah. So when we enter into the world, we don't have knowledge of al-ghaib, of the unseen. However, Allah has instilled within us the organs of perception. So we have al-hissiyya, right? So we have al-hiss, the sensory. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created the human being with the divine design. فَأَحْسَنَ صُوَرَكُمْ. He has perfected our composition. And so each sense is designed in order to give us understanding of the world of created things. So we have a sense of touch. We can feel heat and cold, what's smooth, what's rough. But touch is limited. Touch doesn't allow us to perceive colors, right? So there's a part of reality that's missing. And then it's only sight that allows us to see shapes and colors. So sight is the most far reaching. But sight is limited because you can only see the limitations of, after 100 meters, you're not able to see beyond that. And so hearing allows us, and you can only see in one direction. You can't see behind you. Hearing can hear various different sounds. Taste, that introduces a whole different sense. All of the senses are present, and the sense allows us to experience reality, but that's not the real goal. Some people, they're only existing in the world of the senses. You take that data points, and then what you do is you introduce to them the world of discernment, right? In which you can synthesize and allow yourself to draw conclusions. That is where reason kicks in which you can grasp abstract ideas. You can gain a sense of what's possible, what's impossible. And after you employ your reason, you use your aql, then there's a different eye that is opened, right? Now you're shifting from the physical eye, the basar, and you're shifting into the spiritual eye, the basira. And to some people, it sounds very esoteric. It sounds like very mystical and very hard to understand. No, it's very accessible and very understandable. Basira is about understanding the unseen world, the future, that there are things that exist outside of reason. So part of living in the seen world is understanding. So basira is that I'm witnessing events that are transpiring in the seen world for unseen reasons. And I am doing this action in the seen world, but I'm doing it for a ghaibi reason, for an unseen reason, right? And so that is what it means to have basira. It doesn't mean that you have this eye that's like seeing in 4D, that's seeing like this parallel universe. It's like this virtual reality. No, it's not augmented reality. Basira is about idrak. It's about truly understanding things as they really are. It's not about seeing a different reality, but that our physical reality is limited. And the deeper reality allows you to see the real reality. And then what he mentions is that the father of meaning is more important than the biological meaning. And this is something which is mentioned in Greek philosophy. Plato mentions that in the Republic. as well. Now, Imam al-Ghazali, he encounters a lot of obstacles seeking this certainty. And so when he's in the Nizamiya, now he realizes he has this post, he has this position, he's publishing, he's refuting the Batiniya. But then he does a complete 180, right? After writing the maqasid of falasifa, then he writes Tahafatul Falasifa, the incoherence of the philosophers that we mentioned. And this is really kind of targeted against Ibn Rushd, right? He disproves the logical approach of those Greek-oriented philosophers, and he says that their judgment is not actually based on examination and science, but it's based on assumptions that they simply present as truth. And if anyone studies, Greek philosophy, a lot of it is just starting with certain axioms that we hold these things to be true, but they're not based on any evidence, and these aren't things that are observed. So you just have to. So you're using this philosophical method, but what Imam al-Ghazali is saying is that this is a quasi-science. This is not actually scientific, and so the only thing that can really claim to demonstrate truth and reality and establish certainty, yaqeen, is religion itself. Because remember, in the beginning of the book, he says we're setting out to ascertain certainty. He doesn't want to rely on anything that's shaky. So he rejects tradition. He rejects what the Sufis of his time are calling for. He rejects the Batiniya. He rejects philosophers. And then, after this 10-year period in which he has this crisis of spirituality, which we're not talking about today, but we're going to talk about for the next 3 weeks because that's our focus, he writes the Ihya. And this is a reconstruction project in which he sums all of the various sciences, the usul of the religion, the furu', the way in the branches, and all of the different practices of the Muslim are all summed, and spirituality is all in one masterpiece. This is very important because we have created a false, bifurcated reality of Sharia and Tasawwuf and Tazkiyah, when in fact they have to be fully synthesized together. As Imam Malik mentioned, he said that man تفقه ولم يتزكى فقد تفسق, that um, uh, whoever goes deep into fiqh, into the law, right, and focuses on their actions, but does not purify their heart, that person can become a sinner. And whoever وَمَن تَزَكَّى وَلَمْ يَتَفَقَّى, whoever focuses exclusively on purification of the soul, but does not arrive at the truth through jurisprudence, through examining knowledge of the Quran and the Sunnah, فَقَدْ تَزَنْدَقَ, that person is susceptible to becoming a deviant. Why? Because you have all this irrational exuberance that I want to experience the spiritual ecstasy. I want to be with Allah. I want to experience the divine. I want mushahada. I want mukashafa. But in reality, you don't know how to do it. You don't have a roadmap. You have no guide. So you can easily deviate. Somebody says, oh, do this. And you're like, oh, that looks kind of cool. I'm going to do that. Right? So there are Muslims who just want to emulate what others are doing because it looks like it's going to give them spirituality. And that can take you away. وَمَنْ جَمَعَ بَيْنَ الْإِثْنَيْنِ, right? And whoever joins the Sharia and Tasawwuf and spirituality together. By the way, I use Tasawwuf and Tazkiyah interchangeably. So for me, Sufism and spirituality mean the same thing. I don't mean it with a capital S. I mean it with like a small s, right? So if you join these two together, فَقَدْ تَحَقَّقْ, then you will arrive at your objective. And that's why it's very important that if you find a Muslim who is neglecting knowledge of the Sharia, then that person is going to deviate really far away because they don't have any roadmap how to please and worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as He wants us to worship Him. Their ubudiyah is deficient because there's a sense of entitlement to be like, I'm going to worship Allah the way that I want to worship Him. Then you're not actually actualizing your divine purpose, which is وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسَ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ. So the realization of the potential of the human being is through ubudiyah, is through servitude. But then likewise, if you On the other side, if you delve into spirituality, but you don't have, I'm sorry, the opposite. If you go into the fiqh and the sharia, but you don't go into tasawwuf, your heart will become harsh. And what will end up happening is even worse. You will start learning things that you don't implement, right? كبر مقتا عند الله أن تقولوا ما لا تفعلون. You might become one of those people who carry بئس الاسم الفوس, the people who carry their books on themselves. It's like a donkey. Allah is drawing our attention to people who have memorized verses and who acquire knowledge, but for them it's information, it's not transformation. So he questions this traditional authority. He sees that the Christian children always grow up Christian, the Muslim children become Muslim. And we all know the hadith that each one is yuladu ala al-fitra, that each child and each baby is born on the fitra. The fitra is not only our nature, it is our primordial nature. It is our natural disposition. Each person has a sound nature to seek reality, to seek connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? One of the verses Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, we recited it in Taraweeh, فَاذْكُرُونِي أَذْكُرْكُمْ. Remember me, I will remember you. This is one tafsir. Another possibility is that فَاذْكُرُونِي, remember me, أَذْكُرْكُمْ, I will remind you of yourself. Right? Because why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses the word dhikr? The Quran is a dhikr, is remembrance. And He tells us, وَلَا ذِكْرُ اللَّهِ تَعَالَى. Allah tells us that dhikr is greater than everything. Why is dhikr? Allah told Musa, وَأَقِمِ الصَّلَاةَ لِذِكْرِ, for my remembrance. So everything is about dhikr. But you can only remind someone of something that they, if I tell you something, oh, remember, and I give you a point of trivia that you don't know, so then it's not reminding, then I'm telling you. But the Quran is not telling, the Quran is reminding. Why is the Quran reminding? Because we already know it. That deep within us, we have a sense of yearning, a sense of longing to have that ta'alluq, to have that connection and attachment to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because we were created to love Allah. The highest worship is ma'rifatullah, is knowing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So Allah gave us an intellect in the human being. So that's why we won't say that Allah is unknowable in that way. Even though we cannot truly comprehend Allah, right? كُلُّ مَا خَطَرَ بِبَالِكَ فَاللَّهُ خِلَافُ ذَلِكَ. But we are capable of knowing Allah to the extent that Allah wants us to know Him. And so the knowledge is in knowing who the knower is and who it is that you're seeking to be known. That our realization of our divine purpose is to be abid, to be worshippers of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And if you disregard this, if you ignore it, if you attend to other things, if you go down the road of shahawat, of desires, if you follow your hawa, your whims, will you achieve contentment? You might in a moment find joy, you might find happiness, and you might come to the conclusion that that pleasure is happiness. But that momentary pleasure is just a fleeting sense of happiness. Why? Because there will be that sensation in the soul that doesn't go away. Because if you remove Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala from your as your highest aspiration, then you're going to fill yourself with substitutes. And it's not only drugs that people use as drugs. People use entertainment. People use music. People use relationship. People even use friendships. Not only intimate relationship. They fill themselves with people. People are on social media because they want to feel connection. Right? So there's a sense of void, there's a sense of emptiness, and that is not something unnatural. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He created us with a feeling of hollowness because the heart is a vessel. And the heart by its nature is hollow, and the reason is we need to take this heart, we have to take that hollowness, and what do we need to do with it? what do we do with that hollowness? We're not, if we were already full, then we cannot imbibe, we can't take in the love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created us as a vacuum, because what do we need to suck in? We have to take in that love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that's why it comes and it flows naturally. There's a lot more for us to say, but we'll leave it for the next coming halaqat. Inshallah, we'll complete the whole discussion in 4 halaqat. If it's okay, we'll conclude with أفضل ذكر لا إله إلا الله. We'll do dhikr together. And then before the adhan of Maghrib, I would invite everyone to make dua, because this is the time of istijaba. لا إله إلا الله 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 حسبي ربي جل الله ما في قلبي غير الله نور محمد صلى الله لا إله إلا الله لا إله إلا الله لا إله إلا الله اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد النبي الأمي وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد النبي الأمي وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمد رسول الله أشهد أن محمد رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله.
الله أكبر الله أكبر. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن محمد رسول الله. حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح. قد قامت الصلاة قد قامت الصلاة. الله أكبر الله أكبر. لا إله إلا الله. Can someone come forward here? Yeah. Oh, sorry. Okay, complete the row. All right, heels on the line. استووا استقيموا. Okay. لا إله. الله أكبر. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. يسألك الناس عن الساعة قل إنما علمها عند الله وما يدريك لعل الساعة تكون قريبا إن الله لعن الكافرين وأعد لهم سعيرا خالدين فيها أبدا لا يجدون وليا ولا نصيرا يوم تقلب وجوههم في النار يقولون يا ليتنا أطعنا الله وأطعنا الرسولا وقالوا ربنا إنا أطعنا سادتنا وكبراءنا فأضلونا السبيلا ربنا آتهم ضعفين من العذاب والعنهم لعنا كبيرا يا أيها الذين آمنوا لا تكونوا كالذين آذوا موسى فبرأه الله مما قالوا وكان عند الله وجيها. الله أكبر. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله وقولوا قولا سديدا يصلح لكم أعمالكم ويغفر لكم ذنوبكم ومن يطع الله ورسوله فقد فاز فوزا عظيما. إنا عرضنا الأمانة على السماوات والأرض والجبال إنا عرضنا الأمانة على السماوات والأرض والجبال فأبين أن يحملنها وأشفقن منها وحملها الإنسان إنه كان ظلوما جهولا. ليعذب الله المنافقين والمنافقات والمشركين والمشركات ويتوب الله على المؤمنين والمؤمنات وكان الله غفورا رحيما. الله أكبر. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Welcome again. If this is your first night with ICCP. May Allah accept all of your worship and all of your good deeds and your fasting and your prayer. If the kids want to make their way over, we'll start serving them. For the rest of us, after you complete your sunnah prayers, you can walk over to the barn and we'll have two lines for the gents and for the ladies. It'll take a few minutes before we start because they're getting the food ready.
الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله